All right, good morning, everyone. So, I'm going to do a series on the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, otherwise known as the Bill of Rights, which are a, a foundational part to the original construct and intent of our government. They're formed around the sovereignty of the individual and groups of individuals in order to protect them from a tyrannical government. So the United States coming out of the Revolutionary War after having been servants of the despot that was the English crown under King George and many others prior to his reign for the first couple hundred years of the establishment of the United States, first as English colonies. So when the founding fathers put these together, these first 10 at the original ratification of the U.S. Constitution, they had that recent memory of just having fought the American Revolution within their lifetimes, something like 11 or 12 years prior, excuse me, at the forefront. And knowing that whatever government that needed to be established for and by the good of the people also needed to have checks and balances in order to protect the people that it was designed to serve. Unfortunately, in our society today, and probably throughout the history of our country, we've had breaches of each of these 10 amendments. So I'm going to talk about them one by one and how there are some ways that I see that we have trampled on them, much to our own demise. For if the value and the sovereignty of the individual is not respected as the bedrock of our foundation, then the extrapolation of those individuals into groups and then into government becomes rotten, because at its core is rotten, because there's no respect for the sovereignty of that individual. So the first amendment is first for a reason. Probably the most well known is the right to free speech or freedom of the press that we talk about. So here is what the First Amendment says. Congress, so this is the government, after they've established the Continental Congress and what that Congress would look like, and the seats of government and the executive and the legislative and the judicial branches, after they had established these things, they had talked about how Congress specifically, who is the lawmaker, shall not make laws violating the First Amendment, which is as follows. Will make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Or abridge. So I'm actually going to pause there because that's a huge one. If you saw my last post, it was about the foundational principle of my faith in Christ, which is a very specific religion, namely the Christian religion. Now, on first glance, it seems that these are, how would I say, competing interests, competing ideas. How can you say that you're for believing in one religion, which by default means that you disavow other religions, while also supporting the worship of other religions in your own country, if you are truly an American patriot, which I like to think of myself as? So I think about the Bible. So our God warns people throughout the Old and the New Testament against worshiping false idols, worshiping false gods. And he punishes those, in fact, that do. However, he doesn't stop them from doing it. So if God sees fit to respect the free will of man to choose to worship him or to worship false idols, even though it's wrong, who are we as men of God on a far lesser statute to make any laws that prohibit or require people to worship in a particular way? So if God makes the law in our hearts and the law of man that they should not worship false idols, but still lets us do it, who are we to even make a law that God himself subjected to the laws of sovereignty of individual to choose for themselves? Now, that doesn't mean that we should practice any and all religion, Satanism being a prime example. That doesn't mean it's a good idea for us to do that. However, if God allows us to do that, even though it is a violation of the law, we see then through God's heart that He relishes the rights of us to choose, even if it's wrongly, then He does the right to do exactly as He commands. And that's something deep and powerful, I think, there for us to remember. So, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. I think of, to bring it down from a biblical perspective, I think of a skit I saw Chris Rock do once about the difference between could and should. And he says, you can drive a car with your feet if you want to, but that doesn't make it a good idea. And that rings true, I think, in this case. Secondly, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. So this is something that I think our society is wrought with today. Saying what people can and cannot say, making laws. So, for example, the U.S. Attorney General came out with a policy, a warning a couple years ago about labeling parents as domestic terrorists for attending school board meetings, writing letters to their school board, attempting to sway the school boards from teaching the things they had been teaching. So namely like gender ideologies, critical race theories, things of this nature, which I know are hot button topics and topics of discussion for an entire channel in and of themselves, but things of that nature. So they're writing and they're pleading with these school boards, sometimes aggressively, albeit, however, as we'll see in a second, under the protection of the First Amendment. And you now have the chief law enforcement official of the United States, the United States Attorney General, labeling them as domestic terrorists. And they had hearings on Capitol Hill about this, and essentially not denying that, rather proving it. So that right there is an abridging of freedom of speech. You have people getting kicked off of social media platforms for spewing what some would consider hate speech, but others are, I think of that term hate speech, and I can't remember who said it, but it's coming to mind just now about, I think it was Bill Maher, a well-known, let's say, liberal in the modern sense, not in the classical sense of liberalism, who recognizes that hate speech is free speech. It's protected under the umbrella of free speech, because that term of hate speech becomes a very slippery slope when it comes to the actual application of identifying and therefore dismissing or preventing such speech from being spoken. So back to the point of the abridging of freedom of speech, you have people removed from social media platforms. Now, these are not lawmakers. Some of these Twitter or Facebook, the like. So some might say, well, they can do what they want. It's a private platform, and that is fair. However, we've had come out recently that, especially surrounding the elections, Facebook, Twitter, which I think Twitter's actually, no, it's not. It's now owned by Elon Musk. So disregard that thought. We're being contacted by government officials, again, law enforcement officials within the U.S. Attorney General's office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so law enforcement offices, pleading, demanding, I'm not sure the terminology you would use, but it's certainly attempting to influence these private organizations to do just that, to abridge and silence freedom of speech. We saw within the time frame of COVID, people who had contrary opinions to what the primary messages were coming out in an official capacity were removed. These were professionals. Plenty of them were people who, like myself, who were not considered experts, but plenty of the what we would consider experts removed and silenced. Again, maybe not directly, but indirectly influenced through government exercising an authority that, in my opinion, they should not have the right to have. and the press. And so now with social media, kind of, we think of when this was written, you have official ledgers, official papers that are writing this as the press. Today we have so many different varieties of press. It's hard to know where one man's opinion starts and stops with what the press would be constituted. So they've kind of formed an amalgam that perhaps wasn't necessarily the case 300 years ago. And then lastly, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. To peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the first example that pops into my head is what I just said about prohibiting the freedom, or abridging the freedom of speech. So the parents reaching out to the school boards, again, private citizens reaching out to a government capacity entity, the Department of Education at the top, at the federal level, down to the states, each have their own education departments. So taxpayer-funded organizations, aka the government, labeling people as terrorists who, to at least to my perspective, and this is perhaps I could be wrong, at least by and large in the majority of the cases, were attempting to petition the government peacefully for a redress of grievances, and then being silenced or labeled as domestic terrorists, which in my opinion is nothing short of a ridiculous term. We think about January 6th and the attempted coup at the Capitol, or so it's been labeled. So, hot button topic. Was that a violent attempt at the overthrow of a government? I think not. For that many people to only have that minimal amount of damage done, to me, does not speak of a coordinated effort to violently overthrow our government. Was it completely peaceful? No. Damages were done to the federal building. However, in the recent weeks, we've had a lot of previously unaired, or at least in larger sphere, unnoticed footage from January 6th of 2021 that would lend itself to shape the opinion of somebody who's watching everything to see that it was more peaceful than we were led to believe. So if we have a scale, this is by degrees, not necessarily in the peaceful camp or the violent camp. There are scales of this thing, I think, where we were led to believe that initially it was on this end of the spectrum in terms of the violence, further towards the violent end, when in reality it seemed much more towards the peaceful end, with the exception of a minority of the people who were actually being quote unquote violent, really damaging. And even then, there's the jury's still out, it seems like, on how much of that was intentionally incited by either government officials or other government officials, and not by the quote-unquote the people acting on behalf of theirs and their own and their families or local communities' interests. So we have that in the charade that has become, which serves perhaps a couple purposes, one of which I'll focus here is to dissuade future petitions and gatherings from occurring, for they would be labeled as violent, extremist. Coming from the military, I saw military members were examined and their loyalties to the Constitution of the United States, and really to the United States as it stands today, were questioned on whether or not, if you recall, the National Guard was activated after this to secure the Capitol, to provide security prior to the inauguration of President Biden. Hundreds of thousands, if I recall, a lot. I think it was the most in history that we had called to the Capitol to defend anything. Some people were not allowed to go based on what they were labeled as Trump loyalists, I think was the term used. So people were not allowed to do their job, which was to serve in the defense and protection of the United States via the constitutional authority that they were given. And we'll talk about in the Second Amendment. Because they were labeled not worthy or a danger, a threat to the U.S. Now, certainly, people within the military can be a threat to the U.S. I just think about the active shooters that wore the uniform and ended up murdering people on military bases. So certainly that can happen. But because they were practicing their freedom of speech as citizens, which military members give up a certain amount of their civil liberties in order to provide for the common defense, because they recognize that to subject their own personal liberties for the good of the common is a necessary evil in order to form a functioning military. But that being said, at what point do we as a society say you have none of these rights, or we've trampled too far on these rights? Is an open-ended question. So these are some ideas in recent memory of what's been floating on. I'm sure there's there's many more historical events in our country's history that have challenged or downright trampled on this First Amendment. But it's very important, and we'll talk about how in the other amendments, essentially, many of them are designed to protect the first, which is that, and again, I'll close with reading it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So I'll leave you guys with that for today, and I'll be talking about the Second Amendment in the near future. Take care. God bless.